So early intervention can make a huge difference. The earlier we intervene, the better the outcome for the challenge. Most people don't get help for the first 6 months. Um, and we want to know more about why that is. And a lot of times, whenever people do experience a traumatic event, they might not want to talk about it for a little bit. Um, so I do wonder if that might be a little bit of why. And then it's stigmatizing by culture, it's embarrassing. They might try to handle it themselves. I know there's a really big movement to destigmatize getting mental health support right now. It's becoming a little more normalized. So I'm hoping that in the future, people feel more comfortable getting that kind of help. If someone is still struggling with a traumatic event 4 weeks after it happened, they need support in handling it. So typically, if somebody's still not sleeping well, that's a big sign. Um, Therapists, I know I have a scale that I use. If I've been seeing somebody for about 6 weeks and they're still struggling, we go through the scale to see, like, okay, what other interventions should we do? Do we need to get you to a psychiatrist to help a little bit more with that? Just because it can really prevent you from living your life long term and having a good life and longevity. Um, it is possible that the symptoms may not show up for about 6 months after the traumatic event. That's the brain's way of protecting yourself. I was talking to somebody who actually experienced the tornado as well, and they were talking about how I feel like I'm not experiencing the trauma because I have to move my stuff out. So their brain is protecting them while they're moving their items out of their apartment. And then she's hopefully going to be able to process it. But a lot of times, whenever that traumatic event happens, the brain tries to protect you. So you might not be able to think about it. You might not be affected by it for a little bit. And then all of a sudden, you might start having flashbacks and having a hard time sleeping.
Yeah, so be really aware that if somebody had something happen and you think, wow, they're doing great, and then 6 months later, a lot of times we don't tie some of those symptoms to that traumatic event, right?
Yeah.
Because it's been so long.
Yeah, and then with people with disabilities, there might be more behaviors or refusals to go do things that they used to enjoy. Again, sometimes people see that as attention-seeking behavior when in reality it's the traumatic event setting in. So that's a really good time to get the help that's needed.
Right. Something else that may happen too is that on an anniversary, which would be longer, but your body remembers that anniversary and you might see behavior again around the anniversary of whatever happened. Even if that person isn't aware of that date, it just tends to be something that your body remembers, even if you don't remember it, that it's that anniversary. All right. So yes, I kind of said this in my introduction that trauma, it might be a trauma reaction versus a disability-driven behavior. So behavior can be an attempt for somebody to communicate, but it can also be a reaction to trauma. Like I said, I had this young man moved in and he probably has 150 IQ. I mean, he's very, very intelligent, but he didn't know how to process what had happened to him. And so, like I said, he was doing things like yelling or putting people in headlocks when he felt threatened, holding on to me in public. And it was all a reaction to trauma. And we see that with people who have had a pretty severe traumatic experience, whether they're trying to figure it out or they're reacting to it. Sometimes your mind can also try to figure it out. Like, let's say you were in a car accident, you don't remember what happened, but your brain is trying to make sense of it. So maybe you're watching every emergency show on TV, some of those kind of things as well. So that behavior makes sense in the initial trauma response. Things like a young woman who, when her family started arguing, she knew the police would be called. So she ran out of the house, which makes perfect sense, right? But then she stayed with a different family, and that family started kind of sarcastically joking around, and she ran out of the house. So the mom followed and said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Well, I didn't want to be there when the police got there." So it makes sense in those initial responses, but it doesn't then in another setting. And then that person can lose, they become isolated because they're reacting in a way people don't understand. So let's say they're in a classroom setting and two of their classmates start arguing and they run out of the classroom. One, they're going to get in trouble for leaving. And two, nobody's going to understand what happened and their reaction. Another situation was a 4-year-old who put spaghetti in his pocket. And when his aunt asked him why, he said, "My mom's new boyfriend won't let me in the kitchen when she's working." And so he was smart, right? Figured out, put food in my pocket, I can have it later. But if you go to school and you put spaghetti in your pocket, you probably have to go to the nurse and change your clothes, and now your clothes don't fit, and your friends are making fun of you, and all these things happen that isolate that child, even though it was a really good adaptive behavior for him to do that in the first place. So we often make that behavior disability related, and some of it is. I'm not saying it isn't, but think about what's going on and how is this person adapting to whatever's going on. And we see things like that in our day program. We had somebody who apparently the abuser had always brought in a fast food cup with a straw in it. And so somebody showed up at the day program with a fast food cup with a straw in it, set it down, and turned around to interact with this person. And this person was obviously reacting to it. But nobody knew what they were reacting to because they didn't think anything of that cup. So it sometimes takes a while to figure out what that reaction is. So how do we know that it's a trauma reaction and not a disability behavior? It's usually because it's very clearly they react to it in a way that makes no sense and is immediate. So
Kind of like a cause and effect. So, like, if something happens and then all of a sudden the effect happens, but the behavior might not make sense with it. Um, at least that's kind of what it reminds me of.
yeah, and we had a staff person in a conversation, and all of a sudden they put their hood up, they shrunk way down, they shut down. And 2 years ago we would have said, I probably would have called the staff person and said, your staff person was rude in class today. And what I realize now is something happened that made that person react, and they were very uncomfortable. And so instead, the call was something happened in class today. We're not quite sure what, and the staff person may need support from you. We've seen that a couple times too in houses where somebody's been there successfully for 3 years or something, and all of a sudden something happens on a day and they react in a way that's not okay, but it doesn't make any sense. And so it's a matter of going back and doing the investigation, figuring out what happened. And then maybe it's not a discipline situation, it's a situation of clearly something happened here. How can we support you so that it doesn't happen again? And how can we put you in a setting where you're going to be safe and feel supported? All right, still no questions, Brianne?
We actually have a couple that have come in.
Cool.
So the first one was from a few slides ago. Do you know if people with disabilities tend to get bullied more than a typical child in school? Is the therapeutic approach different than for a child with a disability?
So, a lot of times people with disabilities have a higher trauma rate, and that does include abuse. It includes turnover with caregivers as they grow up, and people that are in and out of the house supporting them. There has been a big effort. I know the ARC goes into schools to try to raise awareness, and hopefully that does go down. But unfortunately, a lot of times kids can be mean. And whenever I was going into IEPs, I would always recommend social work minutes so that they could see the school counselor and work through those emotions and also work on confidence. I think that's a big thing for kids, and it can be a really good thing for kiddos with disabilities. And I think it can be different for kids with therapy can be different for kids with disabilities. You want to make it more accessible and meeting them where they're at. That's kind of what my whole therapeutic approach is about. Um, each student is not cookie cutter, so I think also just any student, you're going to want to meet them where they're at, but you really want to focus on making it accessible, pictures that are accessible, activities that are accessible. You want your office to be able to fit somebody who uses a wheelchair. So kind of thinking about all those things can definitely benefit them, especially in school settings, because school's hard. It can be hard. in general. And then if you're getting bullied, it's even harder. Hopefully that answered the question.
I know also a lot of our kids with disabilities, and actually a lot of our kids just in general, learn better by moving and process things by moving. And so that recess time, that just giving them time to move around is going to help some of that processing as well. Yeah.
And then the other question is, how is your approach to therapy different for those who don't use words to communicate?
Thank you. So I like to use a lot of pictures um, and feelings wheels, and I do a lot of coping strategies where you learn how to calm your body. So a lot of kind of modeling in our session. So at the beginning of a session, if I'm working with someone who does not use words to communicate, I might do kind of a nervous system calming session for a couple minutes where we give ourselves big hugs, hand squeezes, and do deep breathing. Um, I use a lot of pictures, so an emotion identification cards and an emotions wheel. And if they like videos, sometimes I try to get a video to help them relate to what we might be talking about or the situation that they're seeing me for therapy. Hopefully that answered it too.
Some people use a hand model of the brain too, and this is something we teach our
Mhm.
staff through MANT, which is like, this is that little amygdala that goes, the alarm that goes off, and the rest of our brain usually jumps in and says, okay, everything's okay. But when we're really upset, that like we flip our lid and all we have left is that alarm going off. And so if we can teach people to say, you know, my alarm's
My
going
alarm is
off,
going off.
they can a lot of times then, as if they start to identify that, figure out what they can do to support themselves
Mhm. Yeah,
before those other reactions happen.
yes, yeah, especially like I print off a lot of little like stop signs or I need help and I'll laminate them, especially for kiddos who don't use words to communicate, where if we're working on that regulation piece, like you can pull this out of your pocket or the hand. I'm about to blow my brain. I need to I need a break. So even learning ways to communicate like that they do need a break before they start getting upset or feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. Fidget tools, music, there's all sorts of different things, right? That depends on the person, 100%. All right. So parents as caregivers also experience trauma sometimes from caring for children with special needs. You might have secondary traumatic stress from hearing the stories of what happened or trying to keep up with what's going on at school versus, other places or, just some of the things that are happening as far as physical manifestations of that trauma as well. And then being out of your window of tolerance. So all of us have a window, and that window some days is pretty big, right? And some days it's pretty small. So if I was driving home tonight and got in a car accident, my window of tolerance would be pretty small. I know that after the tornado, I had a coworker came in and said, my window of tolerance is really small today. And how do you know it's small? Well, when it's small, you're like not thinking clearly. You may not be sleeping. You may be really wound up, or you can be on the other end. You might be numb and not feeling anything. And so just be aware that, if you're feeling out of that window of tolerance, it's something that, how can you get yourself back in? And some of those things are, again, music or meditation or exercise or whatever. And some of those you can do with, your child very easily. Let's go take a walk. Let's listen to some music and have a dance party. Sometimes you just need to go to the bathroom and be by yourself for a minute. Vicarious trauma is something that is basically a personality change. Moral injury is when you have to choose to do something against what your personal morals are. And that carries a lot of guilt and also increases the chance that someone would consider suicide. So just be aware of that. And again, we see that sometimes actually they see that high in the medical profession with doctors because they have to decide who gets the heart or prescribe medications that maybe the family can't afford. But we see that also with caregivers sometimes, where they're having to prioritize one child over another because of medical needs or whatever. And then as you're isolated, you don't get that input from other people. So that's really important to get that input. But the longer you're isolated, the less chance you are to reach out to your friends because you feel like they're not there anymore. So usually as caregivers, we isolate ourselves without even realizing it. And I have done that a couple times. And you don't even realize like you're on your own and you're kind of drowning too. And so at that point, it's kind of like you get blinders on and all you can see is that one thing ahead of you, but you're not making good decisions because you're not weighing options. And so bringing a team back in, maybe that looks like meeting with staff and the teacher or whoever, but bringing in those other perspectives again, getting back in touch with your friends and figuring out a way to set some boundaries so you're healthy. So you can bring in those other perspectives because they're going to help a lot. I had somebody we were supporting, he wanted a job. I knew he wanted a job. He kept sabotaging his job. Our whole team was just at our wits' end. What are we going to do? We know he wants a job. We can't figure this out. So we finally sat down and somebody said, well, let's ask him what he liked about the jobs he's had. And what he said is, I don't like working mornings, was one of the things that came out. And guess when every job we had just gotten him was first thing in the morning. And he wanted to work in a restaurant. It's really easy to get a night job in a restaurant. So, and he kept that job for years. So we were so at our wits' end because we couldn't see those pieces anymore because we had just banged our head against the wall so long that it just took the whole team sitting there and actually like asking and going back over what was obvious to figure out what the problem was. And it opened up all our options and all of our perspectives. And then, looking at what are your support needs? What are the support needs of your kids? And how do you balance those? And how do you get other support in just to make sure that's working? So resilience, what does resilience look like? Resilience looks like we've experienced trauma. How are we going to move on from it? Or we're going to protect ourselves so that it doesn't affect us so much in the first place. And things that really, and a lot of this comes from a book by Dr. Karen Harvey, looking at being safe, connected, empowered. And then I've added in sets boundaries because honestly, a lot of our staff don't understand boundaries. So we're really starting to push that, and we're doing that with mental health first aid. But boundaries are something that you set that then if that boundary is crossed, you have an action you're going to take. So you're not saying, oh, they ran over my boundary, I'm powerless. It's I set this boundary and this is what I'm going to do if it happens so that I am empowered. So it probably fits under empowerment, but looking at how do we be safe and how do we help the people we're supporting our caregivers for be safe? Connection, because if we're isolated and we're alone, then that trauma is going to hit us a lot harder than if we're connected. And then how can we be empowered to stand up and say, I need help, or this isn't working for me, or whatever that is.
So repetition can help. A lot of times people with disabilities, so like I really focus on a lot of repetition in my sessions. We might do 4 sessions of very similar things and talking about and going over coping strategies. It can really help people rewire how they respond to things. I do a lot of, where do you feel this feeling in your body? So whenever you start getting anxious, like, do you feel it in your chest? Are your hands sweaty? We do a body scan with that. Like, are you clenching your jaw? And we might do that 3 times throughout the session and for about 5 sessions. So they can really start to feel, okay, I'm about to get anxious. Where are my coping strategies? This helps people heal and they start to be able to do things that they used to not want to. They might start sleeping a little bit better, especially since that you're learning how to calm your nervous system before it completely makes you have a panic attack or have a flashback. And yeah, repetition can just be super helpful with anyone, really. It's like riding a bike. You want to learn how to work those muscles. So working those coping strategies muscles in your brain. I don't know if I said that grammatically correct, but we want to work those coping strategies in our brains. Without doing this. So really we want to focus on repetition, especially like a lot of the people that see in therapy, if they do have reactions that cause them to panic and they might be trying to keep a job, I have them practice a self check-in 3 times a day, when they eat breakfast, when they have lunch, when they have dinner. Um, just so that they can check in with themselves and see, oh, I'm not feeling good right now. I need to do some deep breathing skills. So that gets them into the habit and repetition of noticing how they feel throughout the day.
A lot of people in our society don't recognize more than like 6 emotions, and most of them are negative emotions. So, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, they're basic emotions. So another thing is just helping somebody identify the emotion, because anger isn't a primary emotion, it's a secondary emotion. So what made them get to anger? Were they frustrated? Were they embarrassed? Were they scared? And sometimes, if I say, were you embarrassed? That's going to be met with defensiveness usually. But if I say, it looks like you're embarrassed when this happens, how can I help you so that next time you don't have to deal with that? Do we have a sign between us? And when you make that sign, we need to leave for a while and talk? Or what does that look like? So if we can start identifying more of those emotions, that's going to help as well, just because then that person can start to process them and identify them. Some of you have seen this before. We kind of talked about it a little bit in our last seminar as well, but just making sure that we have connection, safety, empowerment, those boundaries. But sometimes we talked about safe and brave. We had somebody, he got his dream job and he was so empowered. He really wanted it. But there had been an incident on the bus 10 years ago and he didn't want to ride the bus. But that was the only way he could get to his dream job, is using the bus. So then you look at, can this person be empowered? Are they going to be able to do that job? And what do we need to do so he feels safe, right? So that he can get to that job safely. Or I really want to date somebody, but I'm going to have to look at my safety here because I don't know him really well. So am I going to take that risk to get to know him? And is that going to be safe for me? So it's looking at those pieces, and we're going to have to give up a little bit. So we're going to have to be brave to move forward and take a little bit of a risk. And I know Department of Mental Health would love to surround or bubble wrap everybody that has a disability. But when we talk to our accreditor, they say, oh, you're a little bit too safe sometimes. So really looking at what does a risk look like for somebody. For years we said, well, no, you made a medication error, you can't self-medicate. And then our staff made 20 during that time, which isn't ideal. We try to train them really well. But like, why aren't we letting that person learn if we're seeing errors with our staff as well? And then I threw this in too, just because it's something that really helps me with, I've supported a couple people with complex PTSD, and one of them, I was trying so hard to help him, and I just felt like he was pulling me down. And I was, as a caregiver, not doing well. And he told me, you're not enough, you're too late. And so I was talking to one of our staff who has complex PTSD as well. His name is Ronnie Brake, and he said, well, yeah, of course you weren't enough. We're all like trampolines. We need our springs to be able to function as a trampoline, and one spring isn't enough. And so what we've got here is just something that you can use to look at, what does that person's, what are their connections? How are they thriving? And I had one person who said, the one thing that holds me is my schedule. And that was really tenuous, but it gave me an idea of what was going on. So what people are important in that person's life? And let's say they're right at 18 and now all their friends leave for college, and they also played high school sports, and that was really important. And now they've lost both of them. So they've lost at least 2 springs, probably more, because they probably lost more friends and different things that are going on. So like that puts them more at risk. So then when something bad does happen, they don't have that connection and those coping mechanisms that they had when they were in high school and they had that connection. Or you've got an 83-year-old who their best friend just passed away and their eyesight isn't good enough to read the books that they love anymore. And so they've lost a couple springs, and we may say, oh, they're declining, they're failing. But what's really going on is they just don't have those things to keep them going anymore. So think about what people are safe, what people support that person, connect them, And if that person, you see somebody who's starting to look depressed, or they're a caregiver and they're struggling, then make sure, bring those people back into their lives. And that's what a lot of our support systems do. When you call like behavioral health response or some of those, they're looking at who's out there that can surround this person. What places do they feel safe? What things or touch points are important to them? Is there a blanket? Do they need their phone? What are those things that need to be around? And then what activities do they do that ground them and connect them to other people? What kind of things do they go to that they might be missed if they don't show up? And if we're seeing a lot of those springs falling off, helping them to find those springs, and know that right after somebody's experienced trauma, sometimes it's really hard for them to build those springs right away. So it might be supporting them for a while and then starting to look at how you can build those springs with them.
I think this is a good example of protective factors.
Yes. Yeah. So, and those are really important, because if somebody's got strong protective factors, again, a lot of times that trauma will just roll off, or at least not be as severe as it would be otherwise.